the Makerere History and Archaeology seminar. We are joined today by Professor Emma Wild-Wood from the University of Edinburgh, Professor of African Religions and World Christianity, and George Mpanga, who is an independent researcher and has been involved in many very significant historical projects in Uganda in recent years. And they'll be presenting on a book, a collection of texts around Apolo Kivebulaya that they've just translated and published, and talking about sort of the process of publication and collecting those sources. And afterwards, we will have, we're very pleased that we will have comments and questions from our discussant, Dr. Deo Kanamwanji from Chambogo University and an alumnus of our department. So we're very, very happy to have him with us. Just for everyone online, especially, we are in a new venue, so we apologize for the delay. But we have you'll be seeing some photos during the presentation from a slideshow. And if you could just stay muted until the question and answer portion of the discussion. And then if you have a question, use the raise hand button or just type your question in the chat and we'll get to your question. So with that, and I should have said, of course, I think most people online and here know that I'm Edgar Taylor. I'm a lecturer in the department. And this seminar is hosted by the Department of History, Archaeology, and Heritage Studies. And if you don't receive our announcements and would like to, just type your email in the chat and I'll add you to the mailing list. But for now, I'm very pleased to hand over to Emma Wild-Wood and George Mpanga to let us know about, present on this really fascinating set of sources and the publication that's come out of it. So you're both very welcome. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. I hope you can hear me online and in the room. Do wave or do something if you can't. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be speaking to you today. Thank you very much to Edgar for the invitation and to all of you for attending. George and I are going to be talking about a project that we've worked on together for, well, it's now 10 years, although I first started looking at the archives we're going to look at in seriousness in 2013. You see the two books on the slide there. So one is a monograph, but we're talking about the source book today, the Archive of Ugandan Missionary. And I first looked at these archives actually in 1998, when I was living and working in the Kampala area. But I didn't really do anything with them for quite some time and came back. So I want to start off with just saying, well, why would you make a source book of a man called Apolo Kivebulaya? And I'm just wondering if you can put stuff in the chats online, that would be great. But a bit of audience participation. Before this seminar, who here had heard of Apolo Kivebulaya and what did you know about him? So is there anyone in the room, first of all, who'd heard about him before? I don't know whether that's a knowing smile or an unknowing smile. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I heard about, I'm Nicholas Kunameche.
Thank you.
I heard about Apolo Kivebulaya way back in 1995, when I was in P4. There were missionaries who came to us about the spread of Christianity and the role played by Apolo Kivebulaya.
Okay, thank you very much. Anyone else? Yeah.
Francis Xavier Swabi, and I'm a student at Chambogo. I heard about him mainly as a catechist who his evangelical work went beyond Uganda's borders to Zaire.
Mhm.
And his sacrifice in that area was very instrumental to the extent that part of his work was donated for evangelism purposes.
Okay, thank you. And yes.
I'm Jonathan Mesige, MS student at History Department. I've also heard about him, about Apolo Kivebulaya, who was a Christian missionary, and from the reviews I checked through, and I found out that he did a lot of Christian work in Photo. Yes, that's what I heard about him.
Great, thank you. Anyone else?
I only heard about him through your writing, so I can't.
Great. Well, I think that it said something about the project that I'm doing, that most people in Uganda that I have met, and I used to ask border guys if they knew the name Kivebulaya just to kind of test, you know, have heard about him, and the knowledge is different, or perhaps some people have very little knowledge and some people have quite a lot. And depending on which school you go to in Uganda and what subjects you took for A-level, you might find your textbooks teach Apolo Kivebulaya right up to A-level from primary school. So I've looked through some of the textbooks. So he's a figure who's kind of known, but also a bit forgotten. But also for me, here is this clergyman and missionary working for a social and religious change, and that he enables us to see how that worked out, particularly in Toro and in Ituri, to see often a positive reception, but also we get some of that negative towards him, I mean, reception. So the people who are choosing not to become Christians, not to be part of this rapid movement of change. Sometimes we get glimpses of that in these documents. And he's a figure that bridges a sort of gap in Protestant history between the so-called heroic age of the martyrs and the East African revival. And so I discuss this in the monograph I've written, and you can see more about more information. Just to give you a brief outline, Kivebulaya was curious about Christianity for several years before being baptized in 1895. He went to Toro that same year as a church teacher, and he had his first visit to Mboga in Ituri, now in the Democratic Republic of Congo, from 1896. He was mainly working in Toro until 1915, but he was traveling around a lot, and that included going over the Semiliki River. And then he was mainly working in Ituri from Mboga from 1915 till his death in 1933. So that gives you some idea. And these photographs are not in the collection we're going to talk about, but I just thought you would like to see. It's always nice to have some images that I've picked up from here and there. Some of them are in books, some of them in the Church Missionary Society archives, like that one in the UK. So we're going to be talking about this collection of primary documents. Why are they important? So the diaries, letters, and memoirs in this collection, which is in Makerere, in the Africana collection in Makerere University, provide a rare insight into the ordinary life of this particular person, but also other Ugandan Christian teachers and clergy over 4 decades, 1890s to 1930s, particularly showing the concerns of one early clergyman, his colleagues, friends, and followers, as they describe them in their own words. And I should say that this collection, there's no kind of intellectual history, particularly from this collection. There's no grand historical narratives, there's no lengthy theological treatise. On the contrary, this collection contains everyday jottings of events, occasional reflections, an autobiographical sketch, correspondence about mundanities, finance, travel, greetings, gifts. And also in this collection, there are fond memories about past times spent with a beloved mentor and respected elder. And I think what we see from these collections is that European missionary writings have tended to portray Kivebulaya as this kind of lone pioneer blazing the trail for the gospel. But he himself, from his diaries, seems to have understood himself to be part of a community that was planting the Christian church in different African ethnic polities. And so I think this collection reveals a great deal about his social networks, as well as what he was doing. I'm going to speak a little bit more about the documents and what we do for them as a historian, but I'm going to turn to George now to give his perspective, because I came here in 2013 knowing almost no Luganda. I took lessons, I learned some stuff, a lot of which I have forgotten. But I couldn't have done this project without George, and it has been an absolute pleasure to work alongside George and learn from him. Apolo Kivebulaya was a twin, Waswa, so working with Salongo was particularly insightful. And George worked very closely with these documents, translating, looking at the translations that had been done some time ago, which were in the collections. I had a little go at translating, so I needed somebody to correct my translation, and also a lot of the insights, picking out things that I would have missed because of their cultural resonances. So over to you, George, as translator and researcher.
Thank you very much. I greet you all. My name is George Mpanga Salongo. I belong to Fombe clan. I had in Sibambi somewhere. Nice to meet you. Yes. I first met Dr. Wild-Wood, like she has said, in 2013. I met her through another colleague, Jonathan R., professor in Center College in Kentucky. And I also met John through Dr. China Shaz, who was by then a graduate student, but now a professor to University of Virginia. So the chain has been growing. From Emma, I knew Edgar, and Edgar, it's a very long story. I am also proud to be part of this. When I met Emma, I'll call her Emma, I will reserve it. When I met Emma, I had heard about Kivebulaya, like the question she posed first. I knew Kivebulaya not in depth, but it was my mother who used to sing that song for us, that Apolo, Apolo Kivebulaya, weyakwana bambuti n'abasomesa enjiri. Something that Apolo Kivebulaya befriended the Mbuti people and taught them evangelization and taught them the gospel. And also seeing churches named after Saint Apolo Kivebulaya. At first, the name itself, Kivebulaya, I thought, is he a white person, something? But I later learned in the notes that Kivebulaya was just a name he got, but he also had another name, Monobi, which Sekaba Kamwanga named him, because like you read, or you have already read, he worked on the road construction. And one day Kabaka Mwanga found him building. He was muscular, as you see the photos, and dark-skinned. And then Kabaka Mwanga joked to him like, hey, this guy looks like a Monobi. And from then he called himself Monobi, he added. But his names were Apolo, Waswa, Kivebulaya, Monobi, because he adopted that name. We started because he was a Muganda belonging to Mvuma clan. We also went to the clan heads of Mvuma with her. We talked to them. They told us the history of that clan, that they came from Sese Islands. And then he was a twin who later disassociated himself with them from the customs of twins, but he was a twin. Waswa the elder twin, the elder boy twin. Also visited churches that are named after him, We visited some of them. And the main activity was working with his diaries here at Makerere in the Afrikaner section of the library. Kivebulaya had no formal education, but was able to write all that. In giving his biography, he noted somewhere that learning to read was very difficult because he found the letters very small, but his friend who had attended sessions with Mackay encouraged him to learn. So he learned by himself or with a friend. With the diaries, Kivebulaya kept a regular account of his activities of a committed African clergyman. His diary keeping is accompanied by lists of notes of people and things that were important to him. We are hoping to have the diaries to show to you, but we couldn't get them. Most of the notes of the events of Kivebulaya's life are found in three books, exercise books. These are at least 3 or 4. There are all 3 or 4 other hands who helped Kivebulaya to write in each of these books, as well as his handwriting. They all record his life in first person, singular. The handwriting has not been matched with any other manuscripts, so the scribes remain anonymous. The repetition of certain events written in different handwritings also shows the practice of prose writing and honing of a narrative of a personal sacrifice and God's provision in adversity. The first book is existing only in a facsimile form as a bound copy of a notebook. The original had been in the cave of Namirembe Cathedral. Inquiries at the cathedral offices have yielded no information of the present location of the original, so it may have been lost. The first 16 pages contain a detailed account of his early years in Toro in Kivebulaya's hand. The rest of the book is a mixture of events from 1903 to 1905 and miscellaneous information. The miscellaneous information includes lists of people important to the mission, a history of Kasagama's ascent to the throne, and short notes on biblical passages and church history. The second book is an original black exercise book. It starts twice with words, "This is the first book for me, Apolo, Waswa Kivebulaya," followed by 2 versions of early years, 1892 to 1899. They are all written by someone else with neater handwriting and more fluent in written Luganda. This exercise book also has a record of some events of 1900 to 1919, most of which is in Kivebulaya's hand. There are several letters stuck in the pages. The third book also contains correspondences between 1915 to 1927. There's also the bishop's letter of his deacon's ordination certificate. On another page, he copied the bishop's letter for his ordination as priest. On the final page, there is a record of spending and 3 addresses of women in Ealing, London. Presumably, the women were supporters of his project of evangelization. The most difficult decisions concerning translations and presentations revolved around those texts written by or with Apolo Kivebulaya. The letters and biographies posed some difficulties, but most were in good conditions and clearly written. The autobiography is found on the beginning of one of the notebooks, and the letters were mostly copied or stuck into other notebooks. The dated diary entries are not placed in chronological order, and the notes rarely have a date attached to them. Where possible, we attempted to make the English text as easy as possible for the reader to follow by reordering the material, regularizing spellings of proper nouns, and adding punctuations. There does not appear to be a deliberate order of any kind of the placement of the notes. Kivebulaya does not always use his notebook pages sequentially, left to right. The black exercise book starts from both ends. The orthography also posed some problems for us. Kivebulaya wrote in Old Luganda, which did not use double letters to denote stress. For example, in modern Luganda, okuyiga means to learn, and okuyiga means to hunt. It is occasionally unclear from the context whether the subject of the verb was learning or hunting. Again, in conformity to the older Luganda style, he ran words together which are now run separately, and he capitalized words that are rarely capitalized today. We have reduced the capitalization. His writing is sometimes unclear, and he omits letters. His punctuation is minimal. In longer passages, he created lengthy sentences by linking phrases and. To give the translated text clarity, we are compelled to put in full stop, commas, and inverted commas, which are not in the original. Luganda is the dominant language, but there are other increasing number of Runyoro Rutoro words that creep into Kivebulaya's writings as the years go on. He occasionally adds a Swahili or English word. For example, he used the word omwegesa, a Runyoro Rutoro word for teacher. All these issues present particular challenges to the researcher. Footnotes have been used to indicate some of the occasions where the text slips from Luganda to Runyoro Rutoro, Swahili, or English. With these considerations in mind, we hope that readers will enjoy the straightforward clarity of the translations whilst being mindful of the complexities that have been addressed in the presentation. I thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
George. What I'd like to do now, I don't know whether we want to pause for some questions now or just continue.
It's up to how you like to do it, and I know Dr. Kanamwanji will have, comments to sort of.
Okay, yeah. So
wrap it together,
we'll maybe just continue then.
Sure.
So as you see from what George says, that kind of fine work of getting these two boxes. They're a very, very small part of your amazing Africana collection that's here at Makerere. But going through and trying to work at them. And we were not the first people to do this. They were collected by a woman called Anne Luck, and I'll talk a little bit more about her. But I thought I'd just say a little bit more about the book as it's come to be, and then some of the other considerations that we were thinking about as we were dealing with these documents. So the book is divided, there's quite a long introduction, and some of the things that we're saying have come into that introduction. And then there's an introduction to each of the parts of the book. This is my copy. There should be 2 copies in the library, but they haven't yet been catalogued, we think. So the publisher sent them here so that there would be a copy of 2 copies available. But you can see contents here, and they're divided into 7 parts. So we have an autobiography, which is very short, diaries, which are quite long, some published articles, which are quite short, some correspondence, which is quite lengthy, and then 3 unpublished biographical memoirs about Apolo, 10 oral accounts, 10 or 11 oral accounts. And then we've got articles about Kivebulaya from Luganda periodicals. Most of those are talking about that they're in the 1930s, so they're a couple of years before his death, and then at the point of his death when they were actually recording how he was going to die, because people knew that he was very ill and they were expecting that. So what we've got in writings and correspondence, we read about his ideas about his early life in his autobiography. We meet the many people with whom he worked and lived and travelled between 1894 and 1933. Now, some of this is probably written retrospectively, and that needs to be borne in mind when reading it, but some of it was being written as it happened, and they're just often quite small jottings. And then in the unpublished biographies, the oral testimonies and newspaper reports, we hear the voices of those to whom Kivebulaya brought education, influence, new relationships, and even a sense of purpose. So the people that overwhelmingly we have the positive voices, the people who appreciated and admired him. But in some of their stories, as I said before, we get some of that resistance also to Christianity and to this project of modernity or introducing new things. Now, there's lots of things. It's well known that Baganda Christians evangelized neighboring peoples. Both Anglicans and Catholics did that in very large numbers. But Kivebulaya's writings, as far as I know, are the most comprehensive example of the rationale and the regular routine of one such Christian and his peers. We also know that literacy was significant in evangelization. To read Kusoma became synonymous with Christian worship and attending church. These sources reveal how Kivebulaya and his associates practiced their literacy in notebooks and diaries. You heard about this idea that it's not just one handwriting that's in these diaries. This is more than one person. So they're propagating the importance of reading and writing as a socio-spiritual practice in lots of villages around Toro and Ituri. But they're also honing the craft of literacy. And we can see this as a collective endeavor in these diaries, even though we can't identify who are the other people, who are the sort of amnesis for Kivebulaya. The oral testimonies, which were taken in the 1950s, reveal other attractions of Christianity besides that of literacy. Peaceable relationships with neighboring ethnic groups comes up quite a bit in these testimonies. Power over illness and natural forces, and a new role for young people all emerge. So the sources in this volume, I think, can actually illuminate wider historical processes of social and cultural change, as well as the religious change which propelled their creation. And there are, I know of at least 3 or 4 academic books that refer to Apolo Kivebulaya's collection. But I think there's so much more that could be done with this collection for other projects, if you're interested. One thing the sources don't address directly is the colonial period in which they are set. The oral testimonies in part 6, taken in the 50s, but looking back into the 1920s at least and 30s, some a little bit before, speak of Belgian colonial intrusion into the missionary journeys. They also speak of distrust amongst forest peoples, but there's actually very little mention of wider forces at work. And I think the strength of these sources vis-à-vis colonial history lies in seeing how African peoples made practical accommodations to foreign governance, but also how their daily concerns ignored or circumnavigated or worked with colonial power. There are, I think, different ways in which you can read this depending on the events that are coming up. The sources gathered also provide some limited information on gender and race issues. Kivebulaya's views show the way in which he adapted transnational ideas to respond to local situations. He portrays himself as a new man, avoiding sexual and domestic relations with women that could be seen to be abusive, whilst also promoting the education and protection of women and girls and encouraging them to become church teachers. We've just celebrated the International Women's Day, and I think it's very interesting, although we might want to do things a little bit differently from Kivebulaya and his associates. He was still quite paternal, we would say today. We do see this, him being part of this rethinking relationships between women and men that happened around at the time of Christianity. And the Mengo Church Council notes, which are also here in the archives, or a good number of them, also speak to this, as you've got a dominantly male church council with missionaries and Buganda elite, but working out how they see treating women well, what that means, because quite a lot of people were coming to the council to ask for advice, because the wars had really turned over some of these social relationships, and also the international slave routes, and slavery had affected marital relationships. So we see that in these volumes. But the vast majority of sources in this volume are written by men, or spoken by men. And they do develop this sort of paternalist form of Christianity with an exclusively male clergy. But then we also have one or two women catechists speaking, and women catechists keep appearing in the documents. So it wasn't a sort of blanket male leadership, but it was a hierarchical leadership, where women were very much encouraged to take on prominent roles of leadership, but they weren't all necessarily enabled to do that, because they were still expected to carry on traditional female roles whilst taking on leadership roles. This seems to be something that comes around with every new social change. But on the issue of race in 1931, Kivebulaya publicly stated his friendship with all Europeans, and his desire for racial harmony and cooperation for the social and moral improvement of Africans. And it sounds a little, when you read the documents, it sounds a little naive in some ways. He remembers back to how it used to be, and he's saying at the end of his life, he's calling people to this view. But I think what's very interesting to consider is that in holding this view, he articulated a belief that would gain further traction in the East African Revival. And as you may know, the East African Revival was a Christian movement that, whilst critical of attitudes of racial superiority exhibited by white missionaries, but worked with them from the 1930s to overcome ethnic and racial division. So the East African Revival was very critical about white superiority, and yet kind of felt like they had to work together on this one. And you can see the same kind of ideas coming through with Kivebulaya, which is no surprise, because the early East African revivalists looked up to him as an important model and figure. But I think we need to kind of, when we're doing this kind of project, we need to understand why these documents are kept. How did they come to be in Makerere archives? Because there is a tin trunk feel to the collection. I hope you know this idea of tin trunk, of the idea that, you know, there's a collection under the bed of your uncles and aunts somewhere, that talks about some grandparents who kept a diary or kept some important documents, and it's just waiting there for us to find. But because perhaps their writings didn't quite fit with the status quo, they haven't been publicly acknowledged, and perhaps the family has kept them but not really wanted to share them too much. But we see that tin trunk literature is also something of non-elites, we say, improving their status through literary endeavours. For Kivebulaya, his diaries were preserved by admirers for 20 years. We know certainly that Kivebulaya, who was the first bishop of Western Uganda, was his pupil, if you like, and closest follower in many ways. He was there at his death. And he had some of this material. But then they were collected and placed in Makerere University. And I see this as this collection process as an intersection of institutional and individual interests that allowed Kivebulaya a voice at the fringe of more powerful influences. And there are four main factors, I think, that from the 1950s contributed to the appreciation and therefore the survival of the sources. There was a lively scholarly interest in the history of religious change in the Great Lakes region at this university. There was an Africanization or an enculturation of Christian churches going on at that time, so an interest in who's been early leaders. There was still the maintenance of ties with European missionary societies, in this case, the Church Missionary Society. And there was this legacy of admiration in which Kivebulaya was held in church and missionary circles. And so I think by thinking about the purposes for which the sources were generated or collected, we can also read them on what's called along the archival grain. So why they've come together, what's important, why the social order and the framework that supported their preservation and collection, as well as reading them against the archival grain, that is to identify issues of power and asymmetries of power, and to look for these marginal perspectives in the collections. I'm hoping everybody here knows that, but I'll say it just in case, because it is really worth saying, that the Makerere Africana collection is a very impressive archive, and that it arises from work in the 1950s and 60s of staff and students in the Department of History, as it was then, the East African or Makerere Institute of Social Research, and the Department of Religious Studies and Philosophy. So, of course, you've got some of the great B.A. Ogot, Kiwanuka, Kodpatek, John Mbiti. They're probably perhaps the most well known. I'm sure you know many others. And this collection of African resources was crucial to an early project of what we would call today decolonialization. And there were a number of lecturers here, mainly from Britain, who were part of this project. And from 1964, Louise Pirouet organized a historical data collection across East Africa, collaborating with the universities of Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, and working with students who, of course, had the linguistic ability to gather, copy, and transcribe textual or oral data. And we see, there's so much richness. So I'm talking about one particular collection in this book, but of course, I was using other collections in the Africana collection to build up a bigger picture of Apolo. This particular collection was deposited by a woman called Anne Luck, who was married to a scientist who lectured here. And she wrote a book called African State, The Story of Apolo Kivebulaya, which was published in 1963 by SCN. And so she brought together, so other people have preserved these documents, but in writing her book, she went round and collected them. And it's interesting, her book comes around because she was critical of the previous biographical writings on Kivebulaya. So A.B. Lloyd was the main biographer who started writing biographies of Kivebulaya before he died, and had some quite romanticized stories. It's sort of like hagiography. And Locke was not completely convinced. So this is how she gathered and how she tried to set out that maybe Lloyd was just sort of had too many neat conclusions to his work. So in contrast, I think, to much of the tin trunk writings that Karen Barber and others have written about, Kivebulaya's notebooks were sought out and taken to Makerere, in part because they gave evidence of a singular conformity to values popular in the late colonial Church of Uganda, and consonant with a post-war global evangelical Christianity post-Second World War. They mix introspective piety with a kind of mission station logbook that provided an account of activities. So Kivebulaya isn't attempting to offer an alternative lifestyle or a subversive view, Rather, the contents of his notebooks emphasize what was compelling about a widespread vision of a global Christian community. And this is reinforced by the 3 memoirs in the collection. Byakisaka from Congo, who became Archdeacon of Mboga, Kivebulaya, from Toro, who became bishop, and Kakonge from Buganda, who went to Mboga and worked with Apolo for a year and kept in contact with him. So we've got all clergymen, but all with slightly different interpretations of Kivebulaya, depending on where they came from. And I think we can use that Peterson and Marconi use the word homespun historians, and I think we can see these church leaders as homespun theologians and historians, producing eyewitness accounts to reflect Kivebulaya's commitment to the propagation of Christianity. They place him within a wider biblical framework, using biblical verses and Christian hymns, which is very strong in their accounts. And they cement his reputation as a missionary faithful to the lengthy transnational history of Christianity, and as an Orthodox Protestant clergyman who was introducing these new forms, new in the areas he was going to, of course, new forms of spirituality, education, and healing. The testimonies in these luck files, as I've often called them, but the testimonies are in part 6 of this book, were gathered at a time when oral history techniques were being developed. And again, this is what we need to think about as historians when we use these documents. Luck collaborated with Lucy Ridsdale, who was a CMS missionary in Toro, with excellent Ronyoro Rotoro. I know that because when I was in Boga, everybody used to say, ah, yes, that woman really knew our language spontaneously without me asking. And they really, and her husband didn't know it so well. That was always the comparison. So she had already conducted some interviews. She knew the clergy from Congo because they often visited Fort Portal for church meetings. And she and her husband, Philip, had lived in Mboga for a year in 1950, and they went on to live in there for 12 years when Ridsdale was the first bishop, Anglican bishop in Congo. Lucy Ridsdale was helped by Reverend Nasanari Kabarole, the first clergyman from Mboga, and she also interviewed Yusufu Limenya, who was from the Konjo or Nande people, who was the only non-native Ronyoro Rotoro speaker amongst these people interviewed, and he was also ordained at the same time as Kabarole. All the interviewees had been young converts and church teachers between 1896 and 1933. They had loved Kivebulaya, this comes over in their accounts, and they had been teaching. Some of them had lived in his house. But one of the things we have is that the oral testimonies only now exist in translated textual form. That they weren't recording, they didn't have recording devices except by hand. So there's actually surprisingly good evidence that the interviewers attempted to gather full and accurate records of the conversations. There's quite a rich detail in the transcripts that provides a perspective on life in the Ituri rainforest, and also provides opportunities for reading the other sources like Apolo Kivebulaya's diaries against the grain. So you can do this sort of comparison work even with this quite small collection and see how they're telling things in slightly different ways. So we don't get the testimonies of other villagers or hunter-gatherers, the Mbuti or Chwa, but we do get these asymmetries of power in this one moment of a wider history of exchange and interaction between neighbouring ethnic groups. Furthermore, and I found this very interesting when I was reading them, in these oral accounts, Kivebulaya's spiritual expertise is portrayed as being closer to that of traditional diviners and healers than either Kivebulaya or his 3 clergy biographers were prepared to put into writing. So you get a slightly different take, I think, because of the oral histories and because who's saying it and when they were interviewed. Just to sum up, before I hand over to the respondent, I think that these diaries the tales of Apollo's followers in their oral testimonies and the biographical memoirs can be placed on this textual oral continuum in which oral devices are also apparent in written documents. So we might get slightly different information in the written documents from the oral testimonies, but there's also this bridging. On the one hand, Kivebulaya's writings and the memoirs possess the fixing and memorizing strategies of oral cultures. They're repetitive at times. They're telling that they have kind of mnemonic devices written into them. On the other, a comparison of the documents show how reducing events to writing did give opportunities for expunging parts of the oral world and focusing on the attributes of a new community and personal ideas that are less evident in the oral accounts. Together, these sources are repositories of knowledge and reservoirs of different, slightly different, but shifting perspectives. They are, as someone else put it, sites of power, and their dissonances, silences, conflicts indicate alternate voices and versions of events, and all this requires the historian's attention. The sources are also a guide to framing inquiry. They provide insight into the pivotal role of African clergy and teachers as cultural brokers and societal informers. They show the lives and concerns of Protestant Christians in Toro and Ituri, and they give glimpses into where and why their project was resisted or rejected, accepted, modified, or translated into a new key. And it was this set of documents that was the core for my monograph, that I wanted to really kind of sit with these sources, thinking about them critically, but also trying to hear those voices and to hear the resonances as far as I was able with the help of George, so that the book that I wrote, I hope, sort of represents the hopes and aspirations of this particular time, as well as being able to translate it for a wider audience and bring the kind of wider socio-political framework to bear. Please, at the end, do come and have a look at this book, and hopefully you'll be able to get it out of the library very soon. Thank you.
Thank you both very much for that discussion. And I think we'll just hand it over directly to Dr. Kanamwanji for questions and comments, and then give you a chance to respond. Yep, please. And
Thank you so much, Dr. Edgar Taylor, for inviting me to respond to the presentation of Professor Emma Wild-Wood and my brother George Mpanga as part of Makerere Distinguished History Seminar Series. I would like to extend my appreciation to Professor Wild-Wood and Mr. George Mpanga for sharing their insights with us today. It's an honor to be part of this important conversation and look forward to a rich discussion with the audience. I should note that I also study nation and African Christianity in Eastern Africa. So this topic holds a personal significance to me. I've also had the privilege to read a seminal text, the archives on early missionary writing by and about Reverend Apolo Kivebulaya, 1890s to the 1950s, which is the focus of this discussion. But in the interest of time, I restrict my comments to the strength of the presentation that also applies to the book, as well as 3 questions for Professor Wild-Wood and Mr. George Mpanga to consider as they continue their research on Kivebulaya's question. The first strength that I would like to highlight from this presentation and the book itself is the ability to emphasize the importance of archives, and their responsibility in historical writing. Unfortunately, some historians only turn to the archives as a last resort. And some believe that they can write solely based on given sources. And I find this regrettable. In this presentation and also in their book, Professor Wild-Wood and Mr. Mpanga invite us to reconsider our understanding of archives and their power. Many researchers, including historians, view archives as dusty, dimly lit rooms where old and infrequently used records, documents, and other materials are dumped to make room for more useful records. Useful is points. However, Professor Wild-Wood and Mr. Mpanga, through this presentation and their book, which is meticulously written, show us how these dusted records can provide an incredible source of evidence, weaving a beautiful narrative to tell a story of a Muganda peasant who became a hero to his fellow Africans through his passion. From this archive, they have written another archive, which is the book itself. And you have also become archives, you are saying. I congratulate you, Mr. Mpanga. In my opinion, you are challenging us as historians on two fronts. First, on how we understand and use archives. And secondly, on how we prioritize these archives as spaces for preserving historical materials. How much do we invest in terms of funding to preserve these reservoirs of our heritage? This same question can also be extended to our community, government, and institutional libraries and museums. How can we convince our governments that a nation that does not value and preserve its cultural heritage or records is not a national? You have ably explained how you were able to access some of these records. At an individual level, you are challenging us to also think about how we preserve records of our forefathers, records of people who have lived before us. And I want to imagine that is something that we need to seriously reflect about as historians. The second strength, which really bring out very well, and not only in this position, but also in the group, is the agency of Africans. Christianity arrived with a lot of energy. And in the early years of the church, there was a kind of unexplained negative attitude about Africans. The fact that a gentleman in the name of Apolo could come up and begin to see and equate himself to the white missionaries and begin to propagate the Christian faith to his fellow Africans is something I find quite incredible. And this agency, like you mentioned, is not limited to the Anglican Church. There were several other, energetic men and women in the Catholic Church that spent a lot of time evangelizing their fellow Africans. There was a gentleman called Yohana Mpanga. He was very instrumental in the spread of the church, not only in Uganda here, but also in West Africa. There was another one called Yohana Mpanga. you can also add Gasta Kapere, you can add Joseph Ruanga, you can add Luka Banabachintu, and many others. These ones really brought out not only the voice of the Africans in the mission establishment, but also the ability of the Africans to become disciples to themselves. And I find this quite commendable, and I like the way you weave this throughout your book, and comes a very, very positive thing that I know about this book. The third aspect that I want to really thank you, Mr. Mpanga and Professor Wild-Wood, is the way you expound in the book about the rise of a literate Christian identity in colonial Uganda, and how this education becomes of immense value to the fatherless of Christianity. It facilitated not only the evangelization and discipleship, as the case was with Apolo Kivebulaya, but also the dissemination of the scriptures, church leadership and governance, as well as social and cultural transformation. By learning to read and write, many Africans in the caliber of Apolo Kivebulaya gained knowledge and information that had been previously denied, and this empowered them to challenge the progressive establishment structures and advocate for a just and equitable society. With these three strong points that I find this presentation of the book, I want at this point to raise also three questions and concerns that you can also consider. One, and building it from the challenges my brother Mpanga raised. Were there cases where you are faced with challenges of interpretation and bias in this product, given that you were now dealing and reconciling several sources of information? Yeah, there are cases where this information was conflicting or biased in your view, where the writings about Apolo Kivebulaya by his admirers any different from his own writings about himself, and if they were there, how did you reconcile this? Then and in that very regard, what would be your advice on how historians can negotiate and navigate the challenge of bias in research? The second question that I thought of, which George has partly answered, but still I want him to really elaborate on it. Mr. Mpanga, as the interpreter of these diaries, and aware that sometimes interpreting archival material requires careful attention to detail, research, and understanding of the historical and cultural context of the text. How did you navigate the challenges posed by language? You did explain a bit of that, but I want you to expand, especially in terms of the fact that language is sometimes generational and dynamic. There are cases where you met difficulties in unpacking technical terminologies, where there are cases of illegibility, where there are cases of cultural bias, where there are cases of limitations, there are cases where certain texts were lost in the diaries of the works, and perhaps that's on this, where there are cases where the meaning was not coming out very well. And my last question that directly goes to Professor Wild-Wood is that given that you had access to the Africana collections and you have made a very beautiful comment about it, which advice would you give in terms of improving its accessibility, its diversity, and digitalization? I'm asking this because not many higher institutions in Uganda have the archives to the level of Makerere. How best can linkages be created to allow other users, outside users, to access these archives? As I end, I'd like to commend you, Professor Wild-Wood, and Mr. Mpanga for this insightful presentation and a wonderful post. Your work highlights the importance of archives, oral sources, and nuanced understanding of historical context in reconstructing the life and legacies of historical figures like Apolo. I hope and pray that this work inspires further research and discussion on the history and dynamics of Christianity in Africa. I look forward to the responses and the Q&A. I thank you so much.
Thank you very much for those questions and comments. And I don't know if you can respond to as much of those as you feel able to, and then we'll open up for questions.
George, do you want to start off?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Kanamwanji, and the audience. Oh, yeah, there were challenges while collecting, while working with the diaries especially. The challenges were in a way, like I mentioned somewhere that the language was very old. I can cite an example of the word okubela. Okubela today means like being or something, but in the past it used to help. It used to mean help. Mbera, help me, please mbera. So those words, most of which I did not know, but I discussed those with Dr. Wild-Wood, and we consulted further.
We have these old dictionaries.
Yeah, we have different versions of dictionaries. Yeah, like a language, it grows and grows. And so you asked about negative implication about Apolo. She might have seen, but I never, actually, especially when Apolo died in 1933, many papers we found them, Gambuze, Matalisi, Munno, Ebifa, they all wrote richly about the life of Apolo than when he was still alive. Many long texts about him. So he was praised, but he has read and she has traveled in the Congo, where in the Belgium, she might have seen more, but on my side, I think I saw positive comments about him mainly. Yeah, much as African Library is good, is a very good source, but it also has challenges, according to me. The catalog is it's not good, and also the materials are old. They need to be rebinding. Like sometimes you can go there looking for a Munno newspaper, because Munno was one of the first newspapers here. But they tell you those are, don't touch them because they are, of course, they are in a vulnerable situation. And also another challenge is caused by us, the users of the library, is that some of the responsible users pull out pages. Instead of writing notes or photocopy, they pull out pages so that you can find the next page is not there, and it's the text that is so good, and others mark with the pen. Yeah, so there are challenges like that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think all those things are worth mentioning. I just thought I'd take up this idea of interpretation and bias, and it really goes into the monograph, which is catalogued in the main library and is also, as of this week, available to buy for, I'm not quite sure, what did they say they were selling? It's about $8 or $10 US, but in whatever it is in shillings, from Africa Bookshop in bookstore at the museum. So that's the monograph, and I'm hoping this one may also be published. Sorry, did I say the wrong name?
No, it is this Uganda Society at the Uganda Museum.
Yeah, so you can find a copy of the monograph there, and I hope one day you'll be able to find a copy there that will be printed here and be reasonably priced, and we're working on that project. But in the monograph, I was really wrestling with this form of interpretation, because you can see some sort of conflicting things. So, for example, by the time people are writing these memoirs, they're thinking Apolo is a great person and therefore must have had this great heritage. And so there's this conflicting where people are trying to, and there's a Luganda biography that's published, so not in this collection, by Katongole, and it could do really perhaps with a reprint. But he tries to he and Katonge, both the Baganda, try and give Apolo this really strong heritage, clear heritage that gives him a greater status. And actually, I think he's operating a lot more marginally than they want to believe. So that was one conflict where I had to make a judgment call from the various sources that didn't quite add up. And I hope I've made it clear in the monograph that it is a judgment call, and explain why I came to that conclusion. But if somebody had further evidence, they could perhaps change that. But I think more importantly was thinking about this collection and how the admiration for Apolo Kivebulaya by missionaries and missionary supporters from the UK, and also by some very esteemed Baganda people, and by the court around Daudi Chwa in Toro, lent a certain we could say poignancy to this collection. And so the first chapter in my monograph is actually about, I call it the afterlife of Canon, Saint Canon Apolo Kivebulaya, and talk about how he was remembered and who remembers him and why, also acknowledging that people have forgotten him, because it seems to start with this great admiration that we saw up until the 1960s, really, and then it begins to fade, I think. But, you know, because he's in the textbooks, the school textbooks, by my reckoning, Apolo Kivebulaya gets more mentions in Uganda school textbooks than the Uganda martyrs. You can contradict me if you find alternative evidence, but I think that's really significant, and it says something about it. So I write about that in the first chapter to try and say, well, we need to understand why people are saying certain things about him, and why there might be differences. So that's how I dealt with it on a larger scale. And I think it's one way in which historians might navigate these difficulties if you're particularly focusing on an individual, or an individual has a very strong role in what you're writing. Yeah, I think George has talked about the language challenges. I was pleased sometimes that my Swahili, which I know far better than Luganda, came in useful, because occasionally we find Swahili words or phrases in the text, because of course that was the language of trade in Congo. So Kivebulaya was picking up some of that language. On the accessibility, I mean, I think George has mentioned quite some of the issues that the Africana collection faces. And actually, George has spent much more time there than I have, because he's been working with various people. But I think historians generally, and in the humanities, we have a big job of work to do. Can we make things digital? I noticed somebody was doing some scanning today when we were there, but I'm not sure whether they were scanning as a record. But I'm director of a Centre for the Study of World Christianity at Edinburgh. We have our own collection that's been gathered over the years, and that's largely inaccessible unless you go to Edinburgh. We would like to make it accessible, and it feels like this huge mountain to climb. And you know, when I'm saying accessible, I'm really thinking about digitizing it. But I think there are other things that you can do about publicizing, about making a welcome for researchers. And I do know that national research, so Ugandan researchers, I believe, can use the Africana collection. I think they have to pay a small fee. And quite rightly, the library charges much more for international scholars. I think that's only fair. But I think there is perhaps more to do in encouraging people to use the resources there. I'm thinking about these digitization projects and what we could do. And I think probably the periodicals would be the thing to start with. And there may be some projects underway that I'm unaware of, because I haven't been here for 4 years. Because I know the University of Michigan has been very involved in different projects with different people. So, but it's not, it is an uphill task. And I think for me, what I want to say is, there is this amazing resource, because I have talked to other audiences in Uganda in the past who told me there are no archival sources. They all went to Europe, and I'm going, it's absolutely not the case. There may be archival sources in Europe that people would like to access, and that's very, very difficult. But it's the range of sources here is amazing. And Mountains of the Moon University has a very good archive now in Fort Portal. UCU has a very good, I mean, you know, it's a Church of Uganda archive. And I think these are very important. One thing that struck me when you were talking is that for those people working particularly on the history of Christianity, I hope you know about the Dictionary of African Christian Biography, which is an online source, accessible source, and it's also a participative source. So if you are writing about, if you're doing a project and you've got little biographies of important Christian leaders, then that project wants to hear from you and wants to publish your work. You know, they're usually just 2,000 or 3,000 words long, and it is a public crowdsourcing thing. So there's no monetary benefit, but it's also a nice way to get work recognized, and to get you know, to again applaud the agency of African Christians that you were talking about. So do look at that Dictionary of African Christian Biography. Have a look at what's there and think about contributing to it.
Thank you for that. And I think we have some time to open the floor for questions, both in the room and online. So if you have a question, just raise your hand, or if you're online, you can use the raise hand button or type something in the chat. I also am putting myself down, but I'll, Dr. Tunanuche, please go ahead. And I think just, if you're here, just maybe project a little bit so the microphone can pick up your question.
Yeah, thank you very, very much for this fascinating work on Apolo Kivebulaya and his influence in Christianity spread and more so the history of exchange. I was so much fascinated with this particular influence he made, especially in the interconnectedness between the traditional practice, the traditional religious practices, then the colonial related religions, Catholics and the Anglicans, and then how he managed to bring out the East African revival. But it left me also wondering, do you think, Professor, the story of Kivebulaya can help us understand the rising new religious movements, otherwise probably called the born agains? Now we have quite many. The second question, perhaps a comment, goes to the interpreter, Mr. Mpanga.
Yes.
The name Kivebulaya has also still made me to think a little bit further. Kivebulaya. Bulaya is the well known. Kiva, to come from Gaia. Do you think, is there any relationship with the European influence and the naming of the then this new missionary, Apolo Kivebulaya? And if so, do you think there is something you lost or gained as a result of having the name related to that, to the former, now the religions I can call old religions? Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for that. Yeah. You want to
Yes.
handle
Start there.
either of those? And
Yeah, okay. Maybe if, do you want to talk about the name?
Yeah, thank you very much. Kivebulaya, yeah, like I was confused first, but I think he got that name before he even became interested in Christianity, because as you may know or you will know, he was first, he fought during those wars of Chidiongote. He fought on the side, he first fought on the side of Muslims, and then he fought the Muslims. But that name, in Uganda, there's a song. First of all, you must remember that Kivebulaya never wore shoes in his life, even when he became a canon. He never wore shoes. He was always barefooted. But there is a song in Uganda, I don't know if Professor Kanamwa, you may know it, Kivebulaya buli avaayako nangatto. Yeah, because he never wore shoes. And that song means that whoever comes from Europe wearing shoes, but Kivebulaya never wore shoes at all. So I think it was some kind of a nickname that you never wash shoes, so you never come from Europe. Kivebulaya buli avaayako nangatto. That's when he adopted that name, because he never wore shoes. Yeah, in his life.
Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah, I think it is a really interesting name, and it's the name that he chose. So so he adopted. So he was given as a nickname, we think, probably before he was baptized. It's difficult to know. It seems preferable to Munubi, which I think was a pejorative nickname. So for a while he went by Munubi. Munubi, sorry, yeah. And I think that was a sort of, or at least became pejorative, because the Nubians became despised. And of course, 1897, there's this kind of a battle at which they mutiny. And so, that becomes a negative name. And he obviously was happy to go with the name Kivebulaya. And he didn't really use the names he grew up with at all. And he says he rejected the way of twins. So I think there is something perhaps about in his pride of carrying this name that really says, yes, I'm about all these new things that are connected with Europe. I have this knowledge and this expansion, but I think it comes earlier than his conversion, or certainly his baptism. Can his story help us understand new religious movements? At the end of my monograph, the conclusion is quite a short chapter, and it touches on this. It's not a complete answer. But I think, so I draw out the very, how different he is, this ascetic lifestyle, focused on the word of God. I mean, he talks about the Holy Spirit, certainly, and there is a sense that the Holy Spirit is present, but not a prosperity gospel, quite the reverse, not focusing on evil spirits that we might see in new religious movements. So lots of differences. So I think he would have frowned upon them. But I think where I do see some similarities is that many of the large Pentecostal churches, as I know them in Uganda, and I certainly don't know them all, have this transnational purview. So they see themselves as an organization that's connected beyond Uganda, beyond East Africa, to the wider world. They often borrow, particularly from the States, theologies from the United States and ways of doing things from the United States, but from elsewhere as well. And I think in his time, Kivebulaya had this expansive vision, even though he didn't really operate outside this sort of, well, maybe 300-mile corridor. But he saw himself as a member of a Christian community that was across the globe. He was interested in what I call the universal idea of Christianity, and also the trans-historical, so thinking idea of Christianity. One of the things we don't translate very much of in this book, because it's very difficult and also a bit dull, is he's keeping notes of whether teachings that he's receiving, and a lot of it is church history. So he's mapping himself onto the Bible stories, particularly those of St. Paul, but also onto other Christian stories, and seeing himself as a player on that grand historical and global scale. And I see a little bit that some of the Pentecostal churches are kind of doing that in the way that they speak about themselves in the world and the way that they understand God, even though that they're doing it in a very different way, that Kivebulaya would not have approved of, I don't think.
Yes, please.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Robert, and my question is in regards to limitations, ring fencing. Now that you come to an end of your research, towards the end of this research, I want us to reflect on what we could do next in terms of chronicles of Apolo Kivebulaya. If there is anything that you may put out there for somebody who wants to extend this research further for yourself, given the opportunity, time, and resources, what would that be in particular?
Great question. So I think that the resources are there always for another review and interpretation, perhaps with some sources that I wasn't aware of or we weren't available to us. So I don't think that my work is ever the last word. I think there are some areas that I wish I could have done more on, but my publisher was already saying the book is too long, stop. And the research was very difficult, but I really wanted to learn more about the Mbuti hunter-gatherers. When I lived in Congo in the 90s, I met different groups of Mbuti, and the Boga Church has a sort of proud association with them, but there's lots of gaps in the historiography there. But it was, at the time I was writing this, it's almost impossible to do any research in that area. People are living in fear of their lives most days, and finding the Mbuti, I think, will be tricky. So I had a few resources that I used to write about half a chapter in there, but I would have loved to expand that, but it's a very, very difficult task to do. The other things I think of is that even though the missionary biographies tends to see him as a pioneer, this amazing pioneer, there are still people who say, you know, there are many Apolos, and by which they mean there are many committed Christians who have dedicated their lives, or a small part of their life in some cases, to spreading the Christian gospel, to spreading these ideas of social change that go with it. And there is so much more work to be done there. And I think you're sitting on probably the best resources for Uganda, because I haven't begun to exploit, if that's the right word, the word here. Even today, I was just looking through Mengo notes, and here are these stories popping out of people who are becoming Christians and doing different things, or becoming medical doctors, or orderlies in the hospital, and they're named in these documents, and that might be the only article we get on them, or maybe we begin to match them with others, but it's quite a painstaking task. So your idea of time and resources is well made, because it would take a lot of time to match these. My current project that we've been working on together is actually, and it's in very early stages, so it's a bit hazy, but is actually to look at how health and religion intersect, and trying to do this across the board. So I'm looking very, very closely at Catholic sources, but I'm also trying to learn a lot more about indigenous religious practices of health, and I'm starting with this intersection of, or perhaps clash might be a better idea, of when Western missionaries arrived with a particular, several views of health, actually, not just a biomedical view of health. When you hear Catholics talking about the cure of souls, you realize there's something much bigger going on in their conception of health than a kind of, you know, hospital idea. But nevertheless, trying to show that they are better healers than the traditional healers. And this comes across a little bit with Kivebulaya as well, as he uses some traditional healing practices, if we believe his closest followers, but he doesn't write about those. And so that's an interesting technique. So that there are lots of things, and I hope you two are able to make use of the resources you have here.
There's a question in the chat from Priscilla Singere about, basically, if you could explain about, I'm paraphrasing Priscilla, but just to explain a bit more about his relationship with British missionaries and the British in general, like what was the substance of that relationship?
Yeah. Well, I think this is really interesting, and I think Kivebulaya both conforms to ideas we have about the relationship between Western missionaries and African agents, and also challenges them. Because, for example, he got to know about Christianity almost certainly through his fellow Baganda. At that time, that wasn't unusual. He was baptized by John Roscoe, who is a well-known missionary for writing the anthropology on the Baganda, and working very, very closely with Apolo, who of course wrote the earliest books on Baganda history and anthropology. He goes to Toro before there are any white missionaries there, He's not the first person to go to Toro. There are 4 others that get there before him, and he goes in the next party. He goes to Boga as the second pair of people. But again, long before the white missionaries get there. And so when you get missionaries in Toro at Kabarole for Porto, they are already, Kivebulaya is already preparing the way, and he is our best missionary. So he considers himself a missionary, which is why I use the title. So he writes to London, CMS, he has to be translated, because he never learns English particularly. He writes to the headquarters of CMS Missionary Society as "Dear fellow missionaries." So that's how he sees himself, as an equal. And we get, he accompanies Maddox, Henry Maddox, on a safari. He's the leader, he's taking him. And then he has to bring him back because he falls ill. So he then becomes the carer and protector of this missionary. Then Ruth Herdish, who becomes Ruth Fisher, and Edith Pike turn up as the first women allowed to go to Toro, because there's quite a lot of protection around women's health and well-being at that stage. And Kivebulaya is their chaperone. So if you know anything about late Victorian society, it was quite common for British women to have a male chaperone and not to be able to go around with them. And it's not a white missionary who's the chaperone, it's Kivebulaya. And they write with huge admiration for him. And actually, these ideas of white superiority are already there, because British have this idea that they had this, God was sending them, God was using the empire to spread Christianity and things like that. So they have these ideas of superiority already there, but it was tempered by the fact that those missionaries who first arrived were absolutely hopeless and helpless without people like Kivebulaya, and they knew it, and they write about it. So we often think about these very contested relationships between African agents and missionaries. And a lot of them happen later on in the colonial era when white people are beginning to settle and have commercial endeavors, plantations and things like this, and develop a lifestyle that enables them to distance themselves from the population. But at this early level, Kivebulaya really has quite a lot of agency. However, I should say, I think he was quite canny because he was Mokopi. He was used to working these. He was used to working these relationships, because let's face it, Baganda society was very hierarchical. Toro society was very hierarchical. He knew how to, I don't know what the word is for it, kind of negotiate his way through life.
Yeah.
And so I think also he was doing the same sort of negotiation with white missionaries. So he knew when he needed to give them the sort of respect they were expecting, I suppose. But then he knew how to do that with Han Mukasa and Apolo Kagwa and all these big guys as well. They're doing the same sort of thing. So we need to, I think in all histories, we need to see these kind of stratified layers of relationships going along. So sorry, I should have been turning to the camera. So I hope that's useful, Priscilla.
Yes, Christopher.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation and the book. It has been so much high praise by Dr. and I'm pretty sure many of us here would like to have a piece of it. When you presented about Mr. Mpanga, when you presented about the mixed language used by Apolo, including Kiswahili and Nyoro Toro, in Uganda. I would like to know, what do you think would be, because of the contact he had with people, like his kind of writing was influenced by the contacts he had in place, or it was kind of an interest for him to confuse his maybe would be readers, like, was it a style of actually hiding his communication, or was he communicating to specific people? Because you imagine somebody who is a Muganda is writing in Toro in Europe. Who was he writing to? And when you talk about translating and consulting, and you referred to the language as old language, and we know that at some time, there was a conference. Unfortunately, I don't remember which year. There was a conference about the literature of Uganda, the Ugandography, where we had two reports, the minority report and the majority report, on how to write Uganda grammar in that kind of aspect. I'm wondering if in your translation of these writings, were you referring to one of these reports in referring to new language or language? I would like to know if you use that kind of, I don't know how I can put it, but I'm pretty sure you understand what I'm talking about, especially when it comes to Uganda writing. It is, even today, I work with a museum. Many people have, like, we had some kind of a small run of what would you call a museum in your language? Because we know we have different languages in Uganda and different kind of cultural, grouping, and this museum is not subject to one region or one cultural group or one language or something like that. Everybody has a meaning. Everybody understands what a museum is in their language. And the Luganda language, that the Luganda name that actually came out, it was repressed from normally Katikio uses it, a Kadizo. And a Kadizo, to some extent, some people have come to look at the etymological aspect of it when you say a Kadizo, and some people are saying, no, it's not a Kadizo. So I would like to know which kind of method did you use to come up with an understanding of some of these confusing words in relation to Wangala or Kubuya. I'm sorry, guys, there's some words I cannot put in English. So I don't know. I want to really understand that kind of aspect. Another issue is about do not touch versus do not read. So the do not touch aspect, we find it also in the museum, where museum professionals, curators, are saying we are protecting this piece of material. It's very valuable. The continuous touching, you might contaminate it, or you might be an agent of attracting other insects or something like that, because of the jellies and other aspects in our fingers or hands. And then they do not read because the library is looking at this piece as an invaluable piece. If it gets torn, it may not be used again. So I'm imagining, so if there is this do not read or do not touch this piece, what are we left with now? So I would second the digitization kind of project, and it may not need even so much money, given the fact that we have students who would like to be part of that and do the scanning and so on. In doing so, the students are not only getting the skill of using these machines or whatever, but they're also getting the knowledge that actually is even going to influence them to come back and interact with with these materials they have hoped to create with. So having such kind of interventions, now we know we can read so much about Kivebulaya. And Kivebulaya, as he was asking, I also had a question. Was it something that was given to him as a way of disassociating with him or associating with him? Because you can imagine somebody who is a Muganda with the indigenous kind of cultural aspect, and then he's like, hey, now I am a missionary. This is what we have to do. This is what we have to follow, and we have to leave these norms and so on and so forth. So you would imagine people maybe would either accept him or not accept him and label him something. Is it maybe Kivebulaya, something like that? You're not part of us. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. But it may not be. What I know is Kivebulaya was surrounded by different people. I don't want to call them servants, but the people he lived with, like doctors say that he went to Toro, was what the second group that went to Toro. So his friends were like names of Kabarore, Luheru. As you know that when you live with someone, when I'm with you and I speak a different language from yours, you can kind of borrow my words. And also you must remember that there was the orthography then wasn't so much recognized. I mean, and this is the guy who taught himself how to write. So he could write in every language, but I don't think that he wanted to confuse anyone. And these are his diaries. I don't know if he intended us to read all his diaries, or he wanted to keep them for himself for especially the biblical verses. So I don't think at all that he wanted to confuse anyone. About the language, I don't know. I am blessed to have studied Luganda from childhood. I know where we put 2 vowels and 2 consonants, Okuwangala and Okugumila. So you kind of use that knowledge plus the dictionaries that she has mentioned. We had different versions of dictionary that we consulted. So I'm not saying that our translation was the last. Like she said, it could be it can be still looked at. But all I want to say that we were careful not to distort the meaning of what he meant. Yeah, you can add on.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we were working with, that somebody had done some translations before, not of everything that George translated. So we could actually say, well, they thought it said this, and we think it says this. Are we far wrong? Do we need to rethink? And there weren't so many places where we had a completely different translation. It was more the kind of tone, the stress of the sentence. One thing that's very interesting is that Kivebulaya is translated his letters to Europe, and there are a few of them in here, or at least the replies, are all in Luganda, translated by missionaries, and often those missionaries tend to make the letters more polite and flowery, and George would translate them and say, oh no, they don't really have that tone, they're quite straightforward, they're quite, he's not, as George says, he learned pretty much self-taught, he never had any formal education, because it was only just coming in at that stage. He wasn't at court where there was lots of kind of flowery rhetoric and debate and so forth. So his language is quite straightforward and simple, and that probably helps us in the fact, I mean, we haven't done a sort of survey, but I doubt that his vocabulary is that huge really compared to, he's not a Kagwa or a Mukasa or a James Iwiti or these people who were writing at that time. He's not writing that kind of Luganda. So I think that probably helps. I like this idea of kind of Kivebulaya, the name, as a sort of dissociation. And I mean, I'm sure this is true. What I try and plot in the monograph is, well, why would somebody become a Christian? And there's various theories out there about why the Kingdom of Buganda changes so rapidly to Christianity, and why it's Holly Hansen said it's the Ganda felt they had gone, they were no longer following their habit of thought. They had good values, proverbs that expressed those good values, but things had gone wrong and they were looking for a way out. And people like Mukasa and Kagwa and others led on the way out is Christianity, and it's this Protestant form of Christianity. But I think I hypothesize from evidence, but it's not evidence that's strong enough to be completely convincing, that Kivebulaya may have lost his freedom at some point. He may have come into the orbit of the court because he was enslaved or indentured, or had somehow, because of the famine in Singo, kind of made himself available to work in quite, tough circumstances. And so for Mukopi, I think his options were quite limited, and he was looking for other options. So why do you dissociate from your culture is the question. If your culture doesn't appear to be working for you, you're maybe looking for new ideas, and that's another way why he was very happy to take this nickname, Kivebulaya, and run with it.
There's, why don't we take, just for time, we have a question in the room and a question in the chat. So maybe Jonathan, if you want to go first. Yeah.
Thank you so much, today for this insightful discussion. Actually, I have two questions, but it's fortunate that the professor has just answered one of them, because that I prepared to ask the question concerning his disassociation from the African norms, like moving the name of Waswa. So the professor has answered that one. So the second issue is I don't know whether in your research, if you are faced with the challenge of having different versions of information in the sources, wonder whether you had that challenge. And maybe my question would be, how were you able to maneuver through? Thanks so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
And there's a question from Dr. Mabingo. I don't know if Doctor, if you'd like to unmute and ask, or just have us read the question. But the question, if you're there, you can unmute. But Doctor.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Edgar, and thank you the two presenters for this wonderful presentation. I'm just curious to know. So Apolo as a Muganda evangelizing in different ethnicities. How, all from the diaries, do you get a kind of a sense of how he was able to maneuver through the cross-cultural sensibilities of that time, and whether and if possible, how his pastoral work shaped him as well as he shaped the environment in which he worked? Another kind of added one, I'm very curious to know, him being a twin, does he refer to the twin brother? Because in Uganda, twins, that relationship is so deep and it carries a lot of meaning. Is it that meaning that really pushed him away to become a Christian? Did he hate all things related to twins? I'm just curious to know about that kind of relationship. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I think this will probably have to be our last round of questions. And can I just add a small one in there, maybe not a small one, but about how you've thought about, both of you have thought about authorship, especially when you mentioned there's one case where there's 3 different people writing in the first person as Apolo Kivebulaya. Do you have any insight about, or have you thought your way into what that relationship might have been? Were they translating exactly what he was saying? Are these unknown transcribers or writers? Do they have different styles? How did you make of what authorship meant in that context?
Yeah, great question. I think if I take Dr. Mabigo's question first, because I think it might answer Jonathan's question a little bit. But first of all, the cross-cultural question. I think it's quite, Kivebulaya obviously seems to develop quite a good relationship with people in Toro and certainly in Mboga. So I know this because I spent most of my time when I was doing my doctoral research trying not to ask about questions of Apolo in Congo, because I knew that's all I would get, about the history of the church. If they would just talk to me about Apolo and how wonderful he was, and then bring out the stories from their parents, their grandparents, the very first time I was formally introduced to Apolo Kivebulaya was at his graveside in Edinburgh in 1993. And you know, once we'd stood there long enough and heard some stories, I was then led directly up to the hill to meet a man in his 90s who was one of Apolo's children. Okay, so this strength, sense of not just here's a sort of expatriate missionary coming to Toro who's a Uganda, but here's somebody who is of ours. And once he gets to Boga, they are his children. And this language was still continuing 60 years after his death. And then eventually the penny dropped that this was actually quite important to understand the church in the Anglican Church in Congo, and also to see what Apolo was doing was quite rare. So I think he does have good relationships. Clearly, we don't always get to the bad relationships. I'm sure they were there because he was human like anyone else. But obviously, they don't always come out of in the narratives we hear about. But we do hear about people who he meets a diviner, for example. This is one of my favorite stories. And he says, you know, I'm also a diviner, and tomorrow I'll use my divining tool. And he took out his Bible and read from John 3:16. And the diviner was entirely unimpressed. And so he went on his way. So, you know, you had someone who was like, well, you know, this may be the newfangled divining, but I'm not really interested in it at all. There we also see how he was trying to, you know, although he was interested in the global, although he was interested in these ideas of rupture and of new things and of new ideas and of a new way of living, to communicate, he was using a lot of the old ways, because you have to communicate. You've got to communicate with the people that in their language and in their terms. And so we see a lot of him doing that, but I don't think this is an unculturation project. I think Apolo Kagwa, Daudi Chwa, Ham Mokasa were much more trying to do a more enculturation or Africanization, however you want to talk about it, project with Christianity than he was. And I think there are other people who have done a more thorough job than they did. So I think there's gradations there. But that's the cross-cultural ethnicities. Very briefly, there's a lot more that could be said. I think the shaping of the pastoral work, it definitely did shape him. I mean, a lot of his writings are about his thinking through Bible passages. So he's meditating, I think, on these passages. We can see, you know, he says my favorite passages in 1 year, and they're the pastoral epistles largely, which is about, you know, how to build community, how to build church communities. Kivebulaya and others talk about how he loved Hebrews, which is an interesting choice, and particularly Hebrews 11 by faith, kwa imani is how it is in Swahili, and that's the now the kind of slogan of the Anglican Church there, kwa imani, and there's a book called Kwa Imani Apolo, and St. Paul. So he sees himself as a follower of St. Paul, in Paul's footsteps, doing these missionary journeys. So this is again about him reading himself into these narratives. And Kivebulaya, who has great admiration for him, but also quite good at pointing out specific events, talks about him being willing to go to places that other people didn't want to go to. And he doesn't give exact details, but I think we can match that to a story where Josiah Kamukikwe, who was one of the first clergy there, didn't want to go to a particular place in Toro that didn't always want to be part of the Toro kingdom, and it was a sort of tricky place for the Protestants to work, and Apolo went in his stead. And so we've got these ideas of somebody who was kind of quite humble, but also had this increasingly sense of presence and authority at the same time, if that works. And this is what you keep getting through the stories. The twin, I don't know whether I should defer to Salongo here. I have my own ideas, but we do know that he had a twin sister.
Nakato, yeah.
Except he doesn't call her Nakato, does he? Do you remember? It's Waswa, and they're both the older twin. What's the name for the older girl twin?
Babidi.
Babidi.
Yeah.
So he says his sister is called Babidi, but he's called Waswa.
Oh,
But there's a conundrum, but we know that she died. But I think what he says is, I gave up the Mpisa of twins.
yes.
And whether he felt he had to do this as a Christian or not, it's difficult to know. But the Mpisa were quite onerous, as far as I can understand. You know, you have these name changes, you have the mother being perhaps exalted, but the father, if he goes to war, has to do huge amounts of ritual practices. Twins had to observe certain things at the time. And he says he puts all that aside. He's certainly not buried at the same hour as the hour the twins should be buried.
There were other customs associated to that, like the mother of the twin, Nalongo, was free to steal from anyone's plantations.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, those are the things he wanted to disassociate with. Just as his wife, I think he married for how long?
Yeah, he married possibly just for a few months and she
Yeah.
died.
Yeah, and he never thought about marrying again because of this focus on evangelization. Yeah.
To go to Edgar's question about, I mean, it's a really good question. I find it utterly fascinating when I realized that this was all in a different hand. And I wanted to think about it and learn about it, but it still remains a conundrum largely. We know when Anlock interviewed Nasanari Kabaroli, he said he could identify the other hands, but she didn't write down who they were.
Oh, no.
Or if she did, it's not there. So we kind of, there's certainly a sense of neat tidying up. So one of them is there are some which is almost word for word the same, but the handwriting is much neater, and at times the kind of syntax is just a little bit sharper. So there's a sense of copying. Somebody is improving on what he had jotted down, that's for sure. At other times, it's almost like, I don't know, I have all sorts of ideas in my head, none of which have any historical evidence to back them up, but you know, that he gets to a stage in his life where he has these followers and he just says, right, you know, it's your turn to practice your writing tonight. This is what we did today, jot it down. I mean, there's a picture in this book actually, because there's that gives you the contrast of the diaries. I'm not sure I can find it, where you've got the 1931 diary, which is he writes in every day, and it's a kind of one with a you know, a calendar in it. Oh, there we go. And then there's this, but in the other times you won't be able to see this. You'll have to look at it afterwards. But there looks like some child's drawings. They're maybe trying to work out the different heights of people. There's some maths going on here, or maybe they're doing some accounting. There's words that we could barely make out. And so people, and there's another couple of pages where there looks like there's children's drawings in his diary, like he's just said, amuse yourself. So that's not a very satisfactory answer, but it tells you how far we've got.
To show the online audience here. Yeah. Well, so maybe let's, if with the indulgence of everyone, just maybe one more quick round of questions. Yeah, that's
actually not a question.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yes.
Very, very nice. My interest is in where you see this beautiful knowledge shared.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of the Department of Uganda. This is a very good primary source that they can use to do their teaching and the changes in the history of the Uganda language. So, I thought that would be a very. The other challenge you've left us as a Department of History, and I'm so happy that you listened to your presentation and thank you. Is you've left us a very big question on how we can contribute to the preservation of archives that we have now. Because if people are putting out pages and others, and the only solution is digitizing them, I think what you're telling us today is that we have to look into how to do that at the platform, because it is a very big source of information that we cannot afford to even wait anymore. Because of the rapid loss of information that's going on there. So thank you for raising this issue. I'm sure that many of us we shall put our heads together and see how we can resolve. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we can just add to that, unless we. So there is, why don't, if we have one more hand and another small question in the chat. I think we can do that in like 2 minutes, very briefly, and practically, yes, please go.
Presentation. My question was to Professor. This one, your observation is male. Did he relegate or he promoted the position of women or the female in line with other religions or in line with the period he served in?
Yeah,
And-
go on.
Yeah, and then there's just a question here about whether from Monica again asking how he acquired his canonical training and whether, you know, how you situate that in, I think you've sort of addressed this, but maybe whether this is in the, to what extent the context of British imperialism is dominant in that kind of, and this is something that, you know, Dr. Kanamwanji writes about in another context as well. I mean, how do you interpret that experience of you know, religious education and conversion in this early period?
Yeah, well, two enormous questions, and I've got about a minute and a half to respond to them. Cheekily, I might say, read the monograph, because I address both of these, at least in part, in it. But did he promote women? I mean, I think the position of women is a really interesting one. It seems to me quite clear that if you were a very, very prominent woman at court in either the Kingdom of Buganda or Kingdom of Toro, probably Bunyoro as well, I don't know so well, then you probably lost status as a result of colonial activities, because the European authorities thought that they should be talking to a man and not a woman. So I suspect that if you were really top Namusole or, you know, a position like that, you may have felt you lost status and lost some authority. But my feeling is that for most women, they gained a wider network, a wider opportunity, and that Kivebulaya was one of the people who promoted that. He is quite old-fashioned about it. You know, he still sort of sees himself as the protector of women, and certainly he helps women who are widowed. And he's interested in orphans and that kind of thing, all very biblical, of course. But he expects women to have education. He sets up the girls' school in Mboga. It's one of the first schools in Eastern Congo for girls, as far as I can work out. Of course, Toro had a very strong girls' school, stronger than its boys' school for quite a while. And in Toro, the Queen Mother, the Queen, and Hannah Kagaye, who becomes a missionary herself to in Ankole, and I wish we knew more about her, but was possibly the king's medium before she became a Christian. They change their roles at this time of colonization. So they're probably having less political power, but my goodness, the social power that they had was extraordinary, and they were channeling it through Anglican Christianity and setting up schools and all these kind of things. So that kind of links with the question about training. I think Uganda is unique, or at least very unusual in Africa, and having this very rapid dissemination of Christianity among the people. So, you know, the pages at court, we know, learned, and then they become, very rapidly, they become the rulers. And so I think most people were not being trained by European missionaries, they were being trained by their own people, and that happened very quickly. How that makes a difference to what they learned and so forth is a very good question. But we know that Ham Mukasa had written his commentary on St. Matthew, and it was published in 1900. So that's how quickly, you know, you're getting these things out. We also know that Right Duka also translated some church history books into Luganda, as did some of the other missionaries. There was a chap called Roland who was very hot on Luganda, very good Luganda speaker. We know Right Duka basically taught Pilkington, who, you know, everyone talks about the Pilkington or Biscuit Bible, but it was Right Duka who was doing the work. It was him that was teaching Luganda. We even have a letter from Right Duka when Pilkington died saying, Right Duka is saying of Pilkington, he was one of my best students. So I think we have to be, it's really tricky when we know that the British Protectorate had this big colonial, you know, push with it, and that informed all sorts of things, you know, hut tax and districts and rejigging chiefs and so forth. And we know that that was a huge political issue. But how do I do think there was an awful lot of agency, that you mentioned that word, going on. And I think, how do we hold that intention, and how do we work out at every single step of the way who had the upper hand in the relationship and when it switched, and at what point the same person in one situation could have a lot of power and another situation could have very limited power. And that's why I think we need to talk about power dynamics in a very sophisticated way at this stage. Otherwise, we're in danger of just falling into the trap of erasing African agency, when I think it was incredibly powerful. And this is another thing about reading. Can I just tell my favorite story? So, and I think this is a real indication of how we deal with history. So Apolo Kivebulaya tells a story about, sorry, I was hoping to say hi and now I'm getting carried away. Tells a story about how Lugard ended up supporting Kasagama. He tells it in Luganda. It's quite clear that in this story, and it's been written about elsewhere, people have used it. Steinhardt, who writes a book on the Western Uganda, has used this part of the archive. It's quite clear that Kagwa has the upper hand, and this is a relationship that has been a long time in the making, goes right back to, you know, this tussling between the kingdoms of central Uganda today and their tussles. But does Lugard in his memoirs write about it in that way? Of course not. He's wanting to write home and say, you know, I was in charge all of the time. I knew exactly what was going on, but he simply didn't. Is it in the other colonial archives? Well, no, because they didn't know what was going on either. But people have tended to read the English archives and they're in greater numbers and they triangulate them, but they're not looking for the Luganda archives or for the information that's here. And sometimes I think that gets more to the point of where agency really lay. So I think there's actually still work to do on how these the layers of agency operated. Sorry.
Well, thank you so much, both to Professor Emma Wild-Wood, George Mpanga, Dr. Deokana Wanji. Thank you very much for this really sharing, you know, the process of the book, and yeah, we're looking forward to when the edition is available here. And thank you very much. And thank you to those who've online as well. And just to note that we'll have our next seminar will be on Wednesday next week. I believe it will also be here, the same room, with Esther Guinnestead from Northwestern University on Sciences Po in Paris. She'll be presenting about Luo intellectuals and decolonization. Luo intellectuals in Kampala during the era of decolonization. in the 1950s and 1960s. So if you're available, we'd love to see you then too. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you to all for coming. I really appreciated your questions. I've been making notes.